We live in a world that is deeply permeated by incest. A professor of anthropology from Rutgers University has come to the conclusion that a staggering 80% of all marriages throughout human history were incestuous. And this is not just some common cliche, like everyone is related to everyone else. The situation is much worse than that. He understood incest to mean any marriage with a person who is within the third degree of kinship or even closer. It would seem that for most of history, people lived with a strict taboo on close kin incest. But this rule was for common people. Among society's elite, aristocrats and nobles, incest served as a mechanism to seize and hold power. Hypocrites urged people to follow rules and church decrees, then went on to have heirs with their own sisters. Today I will tell you the story of the greatest incestuous dynasty. They bet all their money on Game of Thrones and lost. Their heirs died at birth, and those who were less fortunate suffered their entire lives. And even in spite of all that, for 2 whole centuries they were considered the greatest dynasty in the world. These were the Habsburgs. We'll explore in detail how they managed to conquer all of Europe. We'll trace how the church used incest in politics, and finally, through tangled family trees, we'll see how incest destroyed an entire empire. This video is more like a dramatic series rather than our usual classic videos, such as Game of Thrones or Succession. However, everything I'm about to discuss with you today actually took place in real life. It's not easy to navigate the 1,000-year history of the Middle Ages. To some, it might seem like one big dark black hole. Such an attitude is quite understandable. Not all of us are historians, but even within the Middle Ages, there was one particular century that, in its level of cruelty and sheer madness, truly stood out significantly from all the others. We are in the 14th century, quite possibly the worst century in the history of mankind. What exactly is happening there? The Crusades are coming to an end. England and France are engaged in a bloody dynastic war, which would later be called the 100 Years' War. Where modern Italy and Spain should be, there is nothing cohesive. Italy itself is a collection of principalities and city-states. In Spain, for 5 centuries, the Reconquista has been ongoing, the expulsion of Muslims from the peninsula. If we look further east, at the territory of modern Central Europe, there will be no Germany. Instead, a colossus rises, the Holy Roman Empire. However, behind this giant's image lies a confederation of 100 princes and dukes incapable of unity. It is precisely here that the main part of our story today will unfold. And far away in the east, Drusus is experiencing the Tatar-Mongol invasion. Such was the general situation in the 14th century. But this is merely a bird's eye view from a map. In art and culture, however, colossal shifts were occurring. Europe is emerging from a long period of cultural stagnation. Dante Alighieri and Petrarch are laying the groundwork for the coming Renaissance. The world seems to be bracing for a major breakthrough. But now, let's view the 14th century through the eyes of its contemporaries. For them, it was arguably the most challenging era in European history for the past 800 years. Just consider the sheer impact of the plague epidemic or the Black Death. Just think about this. In just 7 years, Europe lost between 1/3 and half of its entire population. Literally every second person died. Often there was no one to bury the dead. Diseases weren't a reason to stop the numerous conflicts. European monarchs constantly slaughtered each other for scraps of land for the last 10 centuries. The territory of the former Roman Empire, after being seized by barbarians, was ablaze. There was no escaping the violence. You could move from, for example, northern France to the south, but by exchanging Orléans for Marseille, instead of ruin at the hands of the English, you got a great chance to fall into slavery. The revival of trade in the late Middle Ages led to a rise in piracy. But they plundered not only ships, but also the inhabitants of coastal towns. The most unfortunate were shipped off to North Africa for sale. And now, let's conduct a thought experiment. What would have happened to you if you had the misfortune to be born in the 14th century? Most likely, you would have lived in a peasant family. Back then, 85% of Europeans were rural farmers. Let's assume that in infancy, you escaped death from the very first illness. The plague epidemic either didn't touch you at all, or you miraculously survived it. It left dozens of scars on your body as its own personal autographs. No one has robbed you or killed you up to this point. Success, right? But this is only the beginning of your suffering. Nature in the 14th century intended for you to suffer. The old warm climate is starting to give way to a colder one. Snow is starting to fall not only in England and northern Germany, but even in Italy. This hasn't happened in the last 500 years. During the Great Famine early in the century, up to a quarter of the urban population died. People truly believed that the end times were drawing near. The Antichrist was imminent, and the world's end would soon be upon them. From the 14th to the 19th century, right up until the Industrial Revolution, peasants didn't truly live. They merely struggled to survive. I agree, it all sounds quite dreadful. But let's assume you were still fortunate enough to be born into a wealthy and noble family. Forget the 21st century family model. You're part of a dynasty. Your personal interests are worth absolutely no more than a chamber pot. The family patriarch makes all the decisions. He will dictate what you'll study and when it's time for you to get married. And your primary duty isn't to achieve personal happiness or live in luxury, but rather to significantly multiply the entire family's wealth. Those who have watched at least one season of Game of Thrones will certainly understand what I'm talking about. From their fortified castles, feudal lords controlled all the surrounding villages and collected taxes from them. Essentially, it was nothing more than a simple protection racket. Peasants paid money to feudal lords only so that, in case of trouble, they could be protected from bandits. It's difficult to call this system of relationships a full-fledged state. However, the 14th century shattered the lives of even society's elite. Wars and epidemics decimated not only common peasants, but also knights and nobles. The average lifespan of a European aristocrat dropped from 64 to 45 years. Many noble houses couldn't even maintain their standard of living. They simply died out. But where there's crisis, there are opportunities. On the scorched land known as Europe, a significant amount of open space has appeared. These vacant niches began to be filled by new families. The Trastamaras in Spain, the Ottomans in what is now Turkey, and finally, our protagonists today, the House of Habsburg in Central Europe. Within just 100 or 150 years, the Habsburgs were destined to govern nearly all of Europe. At their peak, both the old and new worlds would be subject to their rule. The entirety of Europe will be afraid to defy their will. And all of this is thanks to their skill in wisely choosing husbands and wives. Who exactly are these Habsburgs, and where did they come from? They were quite an unremarkable family of landowners from Western Germany. Later, they would craft a grand genealogy for themselves, tracing their lineage almost from Julius Caesar himself, or even Aeneas, the legendary founder of Rome. This was all a later legend, designed to conceal and embellish their absolutely unappealing, even somewhat pathetic origins. The first true Habsburg, a man named Guntram the Rich, lived in the 10th century and was an incredibly greedy person. He demanded from the peasants not just payment for the use of their own land, but also compelled them to labor on his fields. All those who refused were ultimately compelled by force. It might seem like a simple thing, but in the 10th century, no serfdom existed yet. Some believed that it was Guntram who became one of the founding fathers of the serfdom system. He would have continued to exploit the peasants further, but Guntram was not only wealthy, but also treacherous. He betrayed the reigning emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and his lands were confiscated as a result. This is where the story of the Habsburgs would have ended before it even truly began. But the seizure of these lands actually happened in favor of his direct heirs. They then proceeded to build Habsburg Castle, which means Hawk Castle. It has survived to this very day. Just take a look at this photo. It's just an ordinary apartment building with crooked windows. This is not how one imagines the castle of a great dynasty. The whole point is that they simply had no money or resources for anything better. So much for Guntram the Rich. The Habsburgs immediately earned themselves a bad reputation. A terrible legend says that one of Guntram's descendants, who had already managed to marry a noblewoman, decided to have some fun. He seduced the daughter of one of the city's artisans, promising her a happy family life. But, as we know, promising doesn't always mean marriage. He left her pregnant, and when she came to demand he honor his word, he simply threw her into the dungeon and starved her to death. As she was dying, the girl pronounced a curse upon the Habsburg dynasty, condemning them to a horrific end. However, this curse clearly had a delayed start function, much like modern washing machines. The dynasty didn't die, it only grew stronger. The Habsburgs developed a very effective strategy. They knew they couldn't rely on force of arms. They lacked money and resources. So they pursued two paths. The first was to be excellent courtiers, to secure lands from the Holy Roman Emperor for good service. But this required hard work, and should you fail, you could pay for it with your very life. The second method, however, proved to be much easier and more pleasant. The Habsburgs scoured all of Germany like an elite marriage agency, seeking wealthy heiresses of noble families, and they married them. The dowry, in the form of lands, was very substantial. That was the whole point. The Habsburgs regarded marriage not merely as an expression of deep love, nor as a sacred spiritual union blessed by the heavens above, but instead as a cold, calculated arrangement for achieving financial and political objectives. Such a stark and brutal cynicism was characteristic of the feudal lords of that era, but the Habsburgs broke records for their callousness. The real champion of Habsburg strategy was Rudolf I. Under him, the dynasty would acquire its ancestral home for centuries, Austria. He was not a pleasant man. On one occasion, a neighboring count deeply insulted him. In retaliation, Rudolf marched into the lands of this count, burning everything in his path. He then bribed the castle guards, broke into the fortress, and personally slew his tormentor. However, Rudolf displayed his essential characteristics like a typical Habsburg of that period, both at court and in bed.